い全国大会目指して頑張ってみたいかあの若い頃の気持ちを取り戻せたら良いのにもしよろしければ行きましょうか願いが叶う街にその時間楽しい年に行くもしかして知ってるのやのととすがり出会うやなものって答えそうかもしれない知りて素晴らしいものそれは救いの神道だ我々の忘れおいでこれは愛の告白願って忘れましょう成長の苦悩世界を恋になり雨のアウハウと叫んで気合い入れよう願いの願うの今日の今日のベケーション今日
Hello and welcome to Japanimation Station, an anime podcast brought to you by the folks at the Weekly Stuff Podcast. I'm Sean Chapman.
And I'm Jonathan Lack.
And we are here to relax, man. We need to chill out. We need to take a break because we've been hard at work here at Japanimation Station over the course of a little more than a year. We've brought you 3 full seasons of the show. We've done The Full Metal Alchemist. We have done the Ufotable Moonworks. We have done all the wacky heists and hijinks of Lupin and the gang. That's a lot of work. So we here at Japanimation Station need to take a little bit of a vacation. And we're going to take a vacation the only way we know how, by making the longest and most ambitious season of the show yet, because we are morons. That's right, we've got our bags packed, we've got our tickets ready. We are heading down to the historic old capital of the Land of the Rising Sun and taking a little drop by one of the greatest animation studios in the world, Kyoto Animation. Get strapped in. This is season 4 of the show. This is Japanimation Station's Kyoto Vacation.
Woo! I've been to Kyoto once before in my life. It was beautiful. There were so many cool things to see. And now we're going back through the world of anime. I'm excited. I love Kyoto.
Yes, to talk outside the metaphor, what this is this a season 4 of the show where we have decided we're going to cover various TV shows and movies from Kyoto Animation, not all of them, because that would be longer than Weekly Suit Gundam if we did all of them. But we are doing a lot of them, and this is a season I'm extremely excited to do. It's one we've been, it's one of the things, the original ideas I had when I was thinking up shifting Weekly Suit Gundam when we were done with that project to more broad anime stuff. It was one of the first things I put in a Word document was KyoAni season, and we are finally here, Jonathan.
And I'm excited. I think this is a season that has been long in the works. It's one I know Sean in particular has been very excited to do. I know he's been working very hard getting everything prepared. I sort of took point on all the season 3 stuff. He's been taking point on season 4. We're recording this just days after finishing season 3. And I asked Sean after we finished season 3, I'm like, do you want to take a break and do this? He's like, no, we're starting right away. I want to watch some KyoAni shows. And I'm like, all right, let's do it. Let's go to Kyoto.
Yeah, so this season is going to be so big that we've decided to do something a little bit different with episode 1 than with our previous shows. We're not covering anything for this episode in terms of TV shows or movies. We're saving that for next week, where we'll cover the first show we're looking at, Air. But basically, this episode is going to be us looking at our itinerary to get back to the vacation metaphor, to see where we're going to be going, where we're going to be checking out, setting our expectations for the season. So we'll cover things like the schedule, what we're watching for this season of the show, and where you can go find it. I also want to talk a little bit about some of the stuff we're not covering and things like that, kind of talk about a little bit of our philosophy of what we did and didn't pick here. This also gives us a space to talk about our expectations and our relationship with KyoAni coming into the season. And then also, I get to take off my English teacher hat and put on a history teacher hat, because I have written what I can only describe as a feature magazine article worth of notes on the history of Kyoto Animation. At some point I should just fucking publish it or some shit, because I've written a lot, because I thought the history segment for this was going to be relatively easy, considering the first thing we're covering was made in 2005, and then it very quickly became apparent to me that the history of KyoAni is very long. It's deceptively very long, and it's also, I think, incredibly fascinating. So I'm hoping that other people think so too, because we have a big history segment today that I did not want to burden an entire TV show discussion with all of that as well, because there's all stuff that needs to be talked about with the history of that show and what's adapting as well. And so I figured we'd kind of clean the plate up, have this episode. This also gives me a chance, Jonathan, to ask you a couple questions I'll do at the end of the show for a couple of concepts and genres and stuff we'll be hitting this season that I don't know what level of experience you have. So there's some stuff that I'm curious to hear from you before we start getting into some of the topics for this year.
Awesome. I'm excited. I love to learn, and I'm excited to learn about the history of Kyoto Animation. Just because, like, I know one thing that happened while we were recording the Lupin the third season is I started noticing them getting credits in some Lupin material for finishing animation, and I was like, wait, but this is before they got famous as Kyoto Animation, which is much more of a 2000s thing, and I asked you about it, and you're like, I've been researching this, Jonathan, it's a long story, so now we're all going to get to learn that story, and it should be fun. And then, as you say, this clears the deck for future episodes, because we've got a lot we are covering this season.
Yes, so before we go over the schedule, I want to go over just a little bit of, like, our background with KyoAni. Jonathan, let's start with you. What is your relationship to KyoAni? Have you seen any of their stuff? What are your, like, impressions of the studio?
I have no real relationship. This is like one of my areas of just non-existent anime knowledge. I mean, I know who they are. I could name some of their famous shows, but I have never watched a KyoAni show really in any context. Probably seen some clips here and there. I know they are beloved. I know they specialize in, a lot of like slice of life kind of stuff, although by no means that's all they do. I think my main thing was just when we started putting this season together, how many things you were putting on the outline that I didn't even realize were Kyoto Animation. Like A Silent Voice is a movie we're watching. I know people love that movie. I bought the Blu-ray of that before we even were going to make this season, and then I didn't watch it because I'm like, I'll just wait to watch it with this season. But I was like, I didn't know that was a Kyoto Animation thing, and just seeing how much stuff they have made over the years that is so beloved. Obviously, I was aware of them also because of the very tragic fire arson attack that happened a few years ago. That is a big moment, obviously, just in Japanese history in general now.
Yeah. For me, and we'll talk about the arson attack a little bit in the history section because it is, I think, an important thing to note there. For me, in my relationship with KyoAni, it was interesting because I started watching a lot of their stuff like well before I knew, like I had no idea what Kyoto Animation was when I first started watching some of their shows. It was before I would have paid attention to things like what is the animation studio that made this. So there were lots of things I watched like Nichijou, Clannad, and Haruhi that I didn't realize all of those, which were all shows I thought were amazing, were all made by the same studio, and not just the same studio, but like the same group of people. Because that's one of the things with KyoAni is it's very sort of consistent, and it's got a really, really high rate of employee retention compared to other animation studios. So it's like a lot of the same people pop up and make those shows. I think it was probably around the time I was finishing up the Haruhi stuff, and I started watching Lucky Star, and then also watching Hyoka, that I realized, oh shit, like these are the same, like this is all the same stuff. And then really started getting into KyoAni. And yeah, like I remember very specifically, I think the first thing I ever saw that was animated by KyoAni was a clip by from Nichijou from a later episode that I now know was directed by Yamada Naoko, who's the director of A Silent Voice and K-On!, a lot of their great stuff. And it's a clip from an episode where it's basically like a silent movie skit where all the main characters are trying to build a literal house of cards, and all these things keep on happening that they're worried is going to knock the house of cards over. And it's all just like character animation and a music score, and there's no talking. And it's such a great classic kind of very like old school animation style humor. And that clip went viral a little bit after that show aired, which that was in 2011. And that kind of put it on my radar, and I watched that, and then I just started, while I was watching other things in my early anime years, realizing, oh, this is all connected. And then I became a big fan. Most of the stuff we're watching this season is stuff I've already seen, because I've seen most of their shows. There's a few things I haven't. Some of it is stuff that we will cover that I'll get to watch. But yes, I have been a big fan of KyoAni for a long time, and so I'm extremely, extremely excited to finally be able to do them for a podcast.
Yeah, I mean, I remember you talked about at least a couple of KyoAni shows in your big anime of the decade episode that we did in 2019, where you talked about, I think, 50 total TV shows on that episode. I know Nichijou was high up there for you. There was a bunch of stuff.
Yeah, Disappearance of Suzumiya Haruhi was my number 10 movie of the 2010s of that decade, because it barely lands in that decade in 2010, but it was, I still will stand by that. I think that movie is fucking amazing. And then, of course, listeners of the Weekly Stuff podcast will probably remember me talking about Violet Evergarden, which was one of the, like, big reasons why, for me, like, some of the ideas around Japanimation Station started forming was me really wanting to do a Violet Evergarden podcast. And it's very much like the Heaven's Feel of this season. Heaven's Feel was I was watching those movies the same time we were doing Weekly Suit Gundam, and I was like, man, it sure would be great if we could do a Weekly Suit Gundam style podcast on how good these movies are. But they're definitely not Gundam movies. And Violet Evergarden was at the same time, 2018 to 2020. And so, yeah, that's one of the reasons why we're coming here at KyoAni is some of these shows are shows that just need to be talked about.
All right, well, let's get started, Sean. What are we covering next?
All right, so let's go over the schedule for this season of Japanimation Station and kind of cover where you can get these, because they're distributed amongst a lot of different places. It's not quite as crazy as Lupin is, because obviously Lupin, we were covering anime from 1971 to 2002, and so that was like all kinds of madness trying to assemble. This is mostly either on Crunchyroll or on High Dive, though there are a couple of other kind of exceptions to that I'll cover as we go through. So this is by far our biggest season. We'll have, if you're counting this episode as episode 1, we are going to have 21 episodes of the season. So there's a lot of stuff we're covering. In order to cover this and kind of figure out how to assemble it, because KyoAni made lots of shows concurrently, so it's hard to just go by chronology because there are multiple series running at the same time. We've tried to group different sort of sections together and come up with 6 different parts. And each of those parts kind of group together sections either by kind of creator or by franchise or series or something that sort of binds them all together. And then I have given all the parts different dumb little names as well. So that's how this will be organized. And of course, when we get to the end of each part, I think we'll also go over how we're going to cover the next part and stuff to kind of remind people. But this will give everyone a general overview of what we're looking at. So part 1, the first thing we are starting with, I'm calling Crying is the Key to Happiness, the key visual novels in adaptation. All of these are adaptations of visual novels made by the video game company Key, and these are going to be our first set of episodes. Our first episode starting next week is going to be a show I have not yet seen, so I'm very excited for, called Air. One note, this will be true of some of these others as well. There is another adaptation of this that is a movie called Air. So if you're watching a movie, you're in the wrong spot because the KyoAni did not make that. I'll talk about what that movie is and why it exists next week. But Air is 12 episodes plus a 1 recap episode, and there are 2 OVAs that are called Air and Summer. It is unclear to me how much new content are in those OVAs, but we'll watch them. I haven't seen this, so I have no idea, but we'll watch them, and if there's enough stuff, we'll add those into the discussion as well. This is one of the only ones that is not streaming anywhere. So obviously you can, go on the internet if you want to find it that way. There's also a very cheap and very easy to find DVD release by Funimation that you can get. I have that DVD release, so I can vouch for that if people want to get physical. Unfortunately, there are no streaming options there. Next up, we'll be covering Kanon. This is a 24-episode TV series. This has an older TV adaptation from 2002 that we are not doing. If you start watching Kanon and you feel like the animation looks like garbage, you're probably watching the wrong one, because that 2002 one is kind of infamous for looking very bad, for looking a lot like Lupin the Third Episode 0 First Contact. If it's that kind of very early digital animation, you're in the wrong place. Kanon is available on Crunchyroll, so you can watch it there. It is also has a similar DVD release by Funimation, so you can pick that up physical if you want. Then we're covering Clannad and Clannad After Story in 2 episodes. After Story is just season 2 of Clannad. So we'll do Clannad, which is 22 episodes, and it has 2 OVAs. Those 2 OVAs we will be covering because they are important. This show is streaming on High Dive, and I believe the OVAs are on there as well. There's also a box set that was recently released by Sentai Filmworks. If people want to pick that up on Blu-ray, it's a bit expensive, but you are getting all the Clannad stuff, and it does have some nice bonus features. So I picked up the box set, so if people want to get that, it's pretty good. Then our 5th episode will be Clannad After Story, the 2nd season of Clannad, which is an additional 22 episodes and an additional two OVAs. These OVAs are also important, so we'll definitely be covering these. It is similarly on High Dive. It is also in that same Sentai Filmworks Blu-ray set. So that will be our first part, those first 5 episodes, covering all of those. Then we'll be moving into what is going to be probably the most complicated section of this season because of how crazy these shows are. Part 2, I'm calling When Christmas Came to Otaku Town, because Christmas is a very important theme in this show, on the Melancholy of Suzumiya Haruhi and Lucky Star. So we'll be covering both the Haruhi series and Lucky Star together here. For people who know a little bit about Haruhi, you know that there's a lot of drama around like what order you watch this stuff in. So this is something I kind of spent a lot of time trying to come up with what made the most sense, and I'm really happy with how we're going to cover this. So we'll do one episode on season 1 of the Melancholy of Suzumiya Haruhi. This is 14 episodes long. All of this stuff is on Crunchyroll. All of it is on Funimation Blu-ray as well, so you can pick it up physical if you want. But this is where we're going to be watching it in the broadcast order. The way that the first season of Haruhi was produced, it was designed so that they took chunks of the original sections of novels that they were adapting and kind of broke up the chronological order and they didn't air the episodes out of order is the wrong way to frame it. They designed the story to be told in a non-chronological fashion, even though they were adapting what is fundamentally a chronologically told source material. So it gets confusing, but they did it intentionally. So we're going to be doing that in broadcast order. What's complicated about this is whether you're watching it on Crunchyroll or you're watching it on the Blu-ray release, all of those are in chronological order, not broadcast order. So you're going to have to jump around. We'll go over this again when we get closer to it, but just to give people a sense of what that is, the broadcast order is episodes 25, 1, 2, 7, 3, 10, 9, 11, 28, 4, 27, 26, 5, 6. So it's going to be a bit of a hassle if you, like me, and I think Jonathan, you as well, have the physical one. You're going to be switching discs quite a bit. But I'm very excited to watch that in broadcast order. I think it'll be interesting. Then we'll be looking at Lucky Star, which is a show made the next year by the same team. Lucky Star is 24 episodes and 1 OVA, and the OVA is very good, so I recommend getting that as well. There is a Blu-ray by Funimation. The Blu-ray is not in the highest quality of all of these, so like it's not one if you're like you want if the reason why you're getting the Blu-ray is you want to see it in the best possible quality. It's kind of an iffy Blu-ray, but it does have everything on there. This is also on Crunchyroll, but if you're watching on Crunchyroll, Crunchyroll does not have the OVA. So if you want to get that and you don't have the physical set, you're going to have to go online. It will be easy to find if you go online. Then we're going to cover Haruhi Season 2, but Haruhi Season 2 is a weird thing, because what Haruhi Season 2 is not Season 2, it is just a 14 new set of episodes, 14 mostly new episodes, that they mix in with the original episodes now aired in chronological order. And that is how it aired in Japan. They basically made 14 episodes, and then they rebroadcast all the original stuff now in chronological order, and just without telling people, just slotted new episodes in there. So you didn't know you had a new episode until you watched something and had the new opening theme start up, basically. And so what we're going to do to cover that is we're going to redo all the season 1 episodes in chronological order with the new episodes inserted in there, which is just the default order on Crunchyroll and on the home release. So if you have those, you can just watch through that normally. Obviously, if you want, you can just pick through, look on Wikipedia what the new episodes are and just watch through those. If you don't want to rewatch all the old stuff, for the purposes of the podcast, we're going to be rewatching the original season as well, because I think a lot of those episodes, there's a couple of them in particular whose context and your understanding of them are going to be radically different. One, just watching in chronological order anyways, but two, with the additional context of the new episodes that are interspersed within there. So I think that's the way that makes the most sense to cover Haruhi, because it most replicates the way in which that show was originally aired. And one of the reasons why we're putting Lucky Star in between is it creates a little bit of a kind of cognitive break, so that way you can revisit those season 1 episodes, I think, a little bit fresher than if we just did them back to back. Then we'll be wrapping up the Haruhi season with the movie Disappearance of Suzumiya Haruhi. Critics say it is one of the best movies of the 2010s. This is easy to find. Has a Funimation Blu-ray. It is currently only on the Funimation streaming service, not on Crunchyroll. I do not know if that will still be true by the time that this episode airs, because it is bizarre to me. But if you want to get it streaming, it is on Funimation. You can pick it up in a couple of other places streaming as well.
Funimation's weird like this. Even though they've merged, Funimation has a separate service that does have some unique content. Like, Funimation has the 5 movie edits of all of the Kimetsu no Yaiba Season 1 stuff, but those are not on Crunchyroll or anywhere else to get. So I have no idea what's going on with that weird corporate situation, because Aniplex is in the mix too because of all the Sony stuff. But yeah, I think it's entirely possible by the time we get there that is different.
Yes. And this is one also I would recommend if you are interested. This is a good Blu-ray, and it's a great movie. It's worth rewatching. I rewatch it every couple of years, so that's one that I would recommend picking the physical one up for, just to have it. Then we're moving on to part 3. Part 3 I'm calling Moe Money, Moe Problems, After School Tea Time with the Girls of K-On! This is just a season entirely about K-On!, which is a delightful show. So we'll be doing K-On! Season 1, or just K-On! With 1 exclamation point. As this title is written, that is 13 episodes and 1 OVA. That is streaming on HiDive. HiDive does not have the OVA. I don't know if I've ever actually watched the OVA for K-On!, so I don't, we'll watch it. I'll definitely watch it. I recommend, Jonathan, you watch it as well. I don't think it's something that's, vital. K-On! Is not a very narrative-heavy show, so it's if you don't see it, it's not the biggest deal in the world. But if you want it, it's not on streaming. There is a Sentai Filmworks Blu-ray box set. That's the only way to get K-On! Is you have to get the whole series, and it is a bit expensive. It is a really nice Blu-ray set, though. It's got a bunch of really good features and stuff, particularly for the movie. It's got a lot of the kind of bonus features that the Japanese sets get that a lot of English sets don't usually get. So if you want to get something physical, it's a bit on the pricey side, but you're getting a lot for it if you pick up that Blu-ray set. Then we'll be doing K-On! Season 2, or as it's properly called, K-On!, which is 2 exclamation points. You have to be very careful on how you pronounce it to properly separate 1 to 2. K-On! Is 26 episodes and 1 OVA. This is on HiDive. HiDive for season 2 does have the OVA. I don't know what the drama is. I don't know why some shows do and don't have OVAs. It's weird, but everything is on there for season 2. This is also on the same Blu-ray set. And then we'll be wrapping up K-On! With K-On! The movie. This is not streaming anywhere in terms of for free, but it is able to buy or rent from YouTube. And it seems like a couple of other services as well, so you can easily rent it for a couple of bucks if you want to. You can also get it from that Blu-ray box set. There was a standalone Blu-ray that they made when the movie came out, but that is long since out of print. So if you want to get it physical, you're just going to have to get it with the whole show. But the whole show is really good, so it's a good set if you want to pick it up. Part 4, these are 2 shows that have no connection to each other whatsoever, but I wanted to cover, so we're just putting them together because they came out around the same time. I'm calling this part My Ordinary Life is a Mystery to be Lived, featuring Nichijou and Hyoka. So we'll be doing Nichijou, also known as My Ordinary Life in English. That is 26 episodes and an OVA called Episode 0. This is streaming on Crunchyroll. Crunchyroll does not have the OVA. If you want to watch that, you have to find it elsewhere. One of those elsewheres is the Funimation Blu-ray set, which is a pretty basic Blu-ray set, but looks really good. So that's a good one to pick up, because this is a show I'd also recommend owning physical because it's so fucking good. You're going to want to watch it again. I've watched Nichijou 4 times at this point, so it's great. Then we're covering Hyoka. Hyoka is 22 episodes and 1 OVA. It is on Crunchyroll without the OVA. This one, the OVA, I'll watch it again for this, but it's not super critical. So if people don't seek it out, it is not particularly important. Hyoka does have a Funimation Blu-ray, and that includes everything. Next up, we've got Part 5. Part 5, I'm calling Yamada Naoko Strikes Back, who's the director of everything we're doing here, or I Have No Voice and I Must Sound, Euphonium, where we are covering the movie A Silent Voice, also known as Koi no Katachi in Japanese. This movie is directed by Yamada Naoko. It had a Shout Factory Blu-ray you can get that's very nice. It is also available to rent on any streaming platform, basically. It's a modern movie. It's very popular, so you can find it basically anywhere. It used to be on Netflix. It's not currently on Netflix. Fucking who knows? It might be on Netflix by the time this episode comes out, but currently it is not streaming for free on any existing service. Then we're doing Sound Euphonium, or Hibike Euphonium in Japanese, seasons 1 and 2 combined. I believe this was on the recommendation of the occasional Thomas, because I have not seen any of the Sound Euphonium stuff. So that is 2 seasons, which is 26 episodes total, and 1 OVA. This is streaming on Crunchyroll. There is no OVA on Crunchyroll. I don't know if the OVA is important. I'll seek it out. This does have a physical set, but these are like that really exploitative, insanely expensive. You get like 6 episodes, but it's like $100 for a Blu-ray, and you get a bunch of goodies you don't want. So I would not recommend getting those. Hibiki Euphonium is one of the only things I don't have the physical media for this season. I have almost everything else, and I'm very upset that it is this awful, shitty, super expensive version is the only way you can get it physical. Then we're doing Liz and the Blue Bird, which is a spin-off movie for Sound Euphonium. Currently, this is only on the English dub is streaming on Crunchyroll, even though it says it has the sub version if you look on the website, but then you click in, there's only the dub there. That might be fixed by the time this airs. I have no idea. If you want to do the English dub version, it is there. This is also available to rent on most platforms like Amazon or YouTube. There's also a Shout Factory Blu-ray that is nice and cheap to get and seems very nice from what I saw. And then we'll be wrapping up this part with Sound Euphonium, the movie, Our Promise, A Brand New Day. Make sure you check the subtitle on that because there were 2 compilation movies that were made for the franchise. We're not covering those because we're just watching the TV show. So make sure you're watching the movie from 2019 called A Brand New Day. This is like Listen to Blue Bird. This is available to rent on most streaming platforms like Amazon or YouTube if you just pay a couple of bucks. There's also a nice Shout Factory Blu-ray for pretty cheap if you want to pick it up physical. And then the final part 6 for our KyoAni season, the Kyoto Animation Vacation here, is Through Rain or Shine, The Life and Times of Violet Evergarden, as I'm calling it. This will be Violet Evergarden, the TV series, which is 13 episodes and 1 OVA. This is one where you definitely need to watch the OVA. I'll say this again when we get to it, but I'd also strongly recommend watching the OVA between episodes 4 and 5, which is where it takes place in the story. And I think it makes everything richer if you watch it in its actual narrative context. Violet Evergarden is streaming on Netflix, and they do have the OVA. It's just in a separate tab called Violet Evergarden Special. So you just have to finish episode 4, go watch the special, come back to episode 5 is how I recommend it. There's also a Funimation Blu-ray set you can get, and that has everything on it. Then we'll be watching the first Violet Evergarden movie. This is called Violet Evergarden Gaiden, Eternity in the Auto Memory Doll. This is the movie that came out in 2019. This is also streaming on Netflix just under the title Violet Evergarden Eternity in the Auto Memory Doll. There's a Funimation Blu-ray of this if you want to pick that up physical. And then the last thing we'll cover is Violet Evergarden, the movie, which is just the title of that movie, even though there was another movie. It's just Violet Evergarden, the movie. This is streaming on Netflix. There's also a Funimation Blu-ray. There's also a 4K Blu-ray you can pick up if you want to get that in fancy 4K. It's the only thing on 4K that we're covering because it's the newest thing just from 2020. And that, Jonathan, in a nutshell, is what we're covering for this season of Japanimation Station.
That sounds pretty simple. Sounds good to me. I have been picking up a lot of this on physical, not some of the more fancy ones, although I did just get in the Violet Evergarden 4K Blu-ray, so I'm excited. I put that, I'm very excited to get to you in a couple of months, yes. Violet Evergarden, but it is sitting on the shelf, and they are all there. One note I'll make on Nichijou, just so you know, Sean, that Funimation Blu-ray is deeply out of print now.
Oh, is it?
Yeah, it's very expensive. If you have an all-region Blu-ray player, you can get it from the UK, or I think the Australian one is cheaper because that's still in print, or at least there's more copies of it around. But if you go to eBay and look for the Funimation one, it's going for $150.
Oh, geez. Yes, you're right. I bought that years ago, so I didn't even think to look that up again. So thanks for pointing that out. Yeah, one of the reasons why I have almost everything we're covering physically is because about half of this I already owned physical before we started doing the season, so I've probably bought even more than I would have just to round out the set. It's one of the reasons why I'm annoyed that Violet Evergarden, even I'm not going to fucking go that far to just own that, or not Violet, Hibiki Euphonium, to own all that physical, even just to round it out. No, that's too much. But everything else I basically got physical. And KyoAni, I would strongly recommend most of this stuff if you're interested. The animation quality is so good, and some of those shows, it really stands out. Some of them, I think, because of how detail-oriented the animation can be, particularly on things like the clothing and the hair, especially for characters, for shows like Hyoka or K-On!, that, compression for streaming can really get, bottled up on that stuff and give you some, less ideal outcomes than other anime maybe would look. And so there's shows that if people are interested in, I think it is a particularly notable upgrade getting it physical, even more so than lots of other anime series. And that's one of the reasons why I got a bunch of this stuff physical over the years, is because they're shows I like. Most of these are things I've watched a couple of times because they're really good and they hold up so well on physical media if that's the way that people want to go.
All right. Well, I am psyched, and this is going to be a long season. We might wind up having to do just so everything can air in order. If we put in breaks, because this is a longer season, they'll be between the parts, you know.
Yes.
So like maybe between part, 1 and 2, there might be a week or two off or something. We will, you'll know that more as we are closer to airing and everything. But yes, I'm glad we have this split up into these nice 6 manageable chunks, because this is a big project. This is a vacation, but we're staying here for a while. I don't think an Airbnb is going to cut it, Sean.
No, yeah, we got to get like a friend down in Kyoto and just like, that we can just like stay at their house, maybe like do some chores for them. So that they can like tolerate us being there, because yes, a hotel would get very expensive if we're there for 21 weeks, which is most of a year. Just to briefly address a couple of things that we're not covering, because I know, Kyoto is so beloved. They've got a lot of really great shows. They have far too many shows and movies that we can cover. There's a few things we're not covering that I just want to kind of, I guess, give a shout out. A big section that we're not doing is there's a lot of shows from like the early 2010s, from like 2012 to 2015 or so, that we are skipping over. Many of them I have seen because I watched them more or less in real time when they were airing. But there's just too many, and they're all kind of like Nichijou and Hyoka. They're all just kind of standalone things that don't really connect, and so it's hard to kind of justify throwing any more in there. But there are shows like Chunibyo, Love Chunibyo, and Other Delusions, which is pretty good. We're skipping that one. The Tamako Market and Tamako Market Movie, which are Yamada Naoko series, we're not doing those. Beyond the Boundary, which that one's not that great. It's one of the reasons why that one was pretty easy for me to cut. But that was around that time. Amagi Brilliant Park and Myriad Colors Phantom World, both of those we're skipping as well. Also pretty good shows. If people want to go check those out, they're good. But they're not like as good as some of the other stuff, and I didn't think would make as interesting in terms of podcast discussions. We're also skipping, and I'm bummed about this because I want to watch it, but it's so long. We're skipping all the free Iwatobi Swim Club, which is the sexy swimming boys show. I want to watch it, but it's like 4 seasons or something. There's like a shit ton of movies, and it would have added, like, it would be the longest part of any of the parts if we did all the free stuff. It was way too much. So that just got cut wholesale because I couldn't vouch for it because I haven't seen it. And so, yeah, so I'm sorry we're not doing the sexy swimming boys. Maybe someday if we do a like additional episode picking up some stuff, we can maybe watch free. Then there's Kobayashi Sanchino Maid Dragon, or Miss Kobayashi's Dragon Maid. That's probably the one that was the hardest cut for me. But that's would be the most recent show if we would have added it. And that also, I feel like we're doing a lot of slice of life kind of stuff. And I felt like it was a little bit easier to cut. And I feel like Violet Evergarden, the movie, makes a good spot to land on rather than doing Kobayashi's Maid Dragon season 2. So yeah, that's some of the stuff that we're not covering, and why maybe again we'll come around in the future and pick up some of that stuff, because it's not that the stuff that we're not covering is bad. It is just that there is way too much, and so lots of things had to end up on the cutting room floor for us to be able to manage this. And even doing that, this is a lot to cover.
This is a lot. Yeah, this is a long ass season, Sean. But I think you made the correct calls, because I can see sort of thematically how we're grouping these. I mean, some of these are very obvious. We're doing K-On! In order, but other ones, like, I think, the thematic groupings make sense, and I'm excited to see all of these together.
Yeah. Is there anything, Jonathan, just like based on the title or what you've heard around it, what are the things you're most excited to cover from the set of things we're looking at here?
Oh, I'm most excited for Melancholy of Suzumiya Haruhi, because I know you love it, and I've been hearing about it for years. I've had the Blu-ray for a while. I've been wanting to watch it, and I kind of wound up putting it off when I realized we were going to eventually do a KyoAni season. And we're going to, just so everyone knows, if you're wondering, like, hey, how are they going to cover the Endless Eight? I came up with an idea for that. We're going to have a fun way we're covering the Endless Eight. So I am very excited for how we're doing that one. And then I think Violet Evergarden, because that's another one that I was very close to just turning on before, like, wait, we're doing a season, just wait on that one. And I'm like, okay, plenty of anime out there. But really all of these, Nichijou, I think also, because you've talked that up so many times over the years, and I am in for some good slice of life comedy.
Yeah, I think I'm in the same spot as you in terms of what I'm most excited for. I think, like, the podcast I'm most excited to do is all the Haruhi stuff. That's just, like, because at first that was the one I was most in some ways trepidatious on, because, like, I just couldn't figure out how the fuck do we even cover this. Like, it's so weird. And then, but kind of figuring out, okay, let's try to replicate as well as we can how it was originally experienced and kind of intended to be viewed, just because that show is trying to fuck with you in certain ways, and it makes sense once you know what the premise of the show is, like why they would design it that way. And I'm just like very interested to, because I have never, that's like the one thing I've not, or one of the few things I've never revisited is the TV show of Haruhi. I've never actually gone back to the TV show, mostly because like the movie's so good and it's like such an easy thing to just watch on its own without having to think about broadcast order and all that shit, that I just kind of, if I want a Haruhi hit every couple of years around Christmas, I just watch the movie. And so I'm excited to watch that show again. I'm very curious to hear like your thoughts and your takes. And then, yeah, Violet Evergarden is, like I said before, that is like the thing that most inspired of these, doing Japanimation Station and like being like, okay, this is a show I really want to, this is a show, and particularly the movie, I really, really wanted to do podcasts on because it's too good. And then for me, I'm also just very excited to cover the stuff I've not seen before, because of this, the stuff I have not seen is Air. I've not seen Kanon. There's actually some of K-On! Season 2 I haven't seen. I watched most of it, but then I ended up dropping off. I forget why. Something else came out, like a game or something around that time. And so there, even though I feel like I've seen it because I've watched so many clips of that in the movie on YouTube, I know like the plot of the movie and everything. I've never actually sat down and finished all of that, like the second half or so of season 2 in the movie. So I'm very excited to actually get to finish that series off, because I've just been meaning to get to it forever. And then I've not seen any of the Sound Euphonium stuff. And actually, I've never seen Silent Voice either. But a weird thing is, I have read the manga of Koi no Katachi. It's one of the rare times in which I started with a manga thing first. And so that was one where I was going to watch the movie, and then we started doing Japanimation Station. I'm like, I'll hold off on the movie. But the manga is fucking amazing. People want to read the manga for Silent Voice / Koi no Katachi. It is one of the best manga I've ever read. Like, I'd put it up there. It's like that, Akira, and Dragon Ball, I would say, are my 3 favorite manga so far.
How long is the manga?
It's only like 5 or 6 volumes.
Okay.
From what I understand, the movie cuts out like most of the stuff from the last volume, or maybe not the full last volume, but some of the stuff at the end, which makes sense. Again, I haven't seen it, so I'm not sure. But like, I'm pretty sure I know where the movie ends, and it's a little bit earlier than the series. But yeah, it's a manga well worth reading. It's not long, but it is fucking great. So yeah, so I'm super excited for everything in the show, but that's kind of some of the stuff I'm most excited to get to.
Thanks for listening to Japanimation Station. If you're enjoying the show, please remember to like and subscribe, leave a review on Apple Podcasts or Spotify, and tell your friends.
You can support the show directly on Ko-fi at the link in the description, and remember to check out the Weekly Stuff Podcast, our long-running series on movies and video games on all platforms.
And now, back to the show.
All right. So now it's time, Jonathan. The moment has come. I'm going to copy and paste into this document my notes I have taken, because I wanted to get your live recording. I wanted to know how far I have gone and if I have done too much or not. And the way I want to do that was live on the air. So let me just hit Control V here, Jonathan, so you can see. Scroll down to the bottom of the document. It's going to take a little bit longer than it used to.
Oh, okay, you made it longer. Yeah, okay.
Yes.
It went from about a 2-page document to 13. Yeah, there we go.
Yep.
Okay, oh no, I see. Yeah, this is you took some inspiration from me and then ran with it, I think, is what I'm seeing here.
Yes, I had too much time to research, because I started researching while we were wrapping up the Lupin the Third. And it's a lot. It's a lot. It's a fucking lot of stuff. But I hope that people find it interesting as we go through this, because it is I think the history of KyoAni is in many ways just the history of anime itself. I feel like I learned a lot about anime. I learned a lot about how it was made. I learned a lot about the business behind it and like the physical process of it. Like there's just a lot of shit that went into how KyoAni came about, and it's fascinating. But it's also, I think, the more I learned about it, the more apparent it became to me that this stuff is really critical to why KyoAni is very unique. Because like just like to set a little bit of the stage, there's a couple things about KyoAni. One, KyoAni is the anime studio that is at the highest profile, but is like the most independent of any studio. So they almost never use like subcontracted studios or outsource things, even more so than Ufotable. Right, this is one of the reasons why KyoAni has a very distinctive style, and KyoAni is one of the only studios that we can do an entire season on that studio's output, because it's so distinctive and it's so singular, but it also has such a clear, like, authorial voice from the whole studio because it's not being outsourced. And how that comes to be becomes really apparent through the history of KyoAni. The other thing that you'll see, that I'll touch on again at the end of this section, is KyoAni is really famous for being one of the most, if not the most, like, equitable animation studios in Japan. They have lots of full-time, like, contract employees rather than using freelancing as their main source of labor, which is what most anime studios do. They have a far, far, far higher rate of female employees. That'll be something that becomes obvious as we go through the season. You'll be hearing about a lot more women at all ranges of production, whether they're the director, the writer, and like animation director, art designer, character designer. I don't think we've ever covered an anime thing that's been directed by a woman. We've done like Mari Okada has been like the writer. We've done some stuff where the animation director was a woman, but we're going to do stuff where women are at all stages. And then obviously all in terms of like the bulk of the workforce, lots of women working there as well. That is also something that will be apparent when we go through their stuff. So I think there's a lot going here into KyoAni's history, and it's pretty unique within the world of anime. Before we get into that stuff, though, I do want to address something that, John, that you talked about briefly earlier, which is the Kyoto Animation arson attack, just because this is something that while I was doing the research, it was kind of, there's a weird irony to it, a very kind of dark irony to it, where the research was actually really easy to do. It's one of the reasons why I did so much, but that's because so much was written about the studio in the wake of that attack in 2019. And I want to kind of address it up here at the top, just in case people don't know about it and didn't like sort of hear about it when it was happening. And also because there are going to be some of the people that we talk about later in this history section who lost their lives during that attack. And so it's something that I don't want people to be like, what the fuck is he talking about when we get there? So this Kyoto Animation arson attack, basically what it is. On July 18th, 2019, the perpetrator of the attack caused an explosion and set fire to Kyoto Animation Studio 1. Studio 1 was one of the main production studios KyoAni had used since it was built in 2007. The fire, because of partly of the design of the building, the fire rapidly spread throughout the entire building. The fire ultimately killed 36 people and it injured an additional 34. The perpetrator was arrested at the scene, and I guess by the time this comes out, the trial will probably have happened or at least begun. As we're recording this, he's currently awaiting trial in September. The perpetrator had a previous arrest for armed robbery and a history of mental illness. If people are curious about the reasons he gave for why he did this attack, he accused KyoAni of plagiarizing ideas from a novel he had submitted to a KyoAni contest, but all investigation has found that that is completely untrue. He did submit a novel, but there are no connections to any of the KyoAni shows, and the novel was basically weeded out in the first round of kind of seeing if it would be accepted or dismissed from the contest. So yeah, many of the directors, animators, and artists that we're going to talk about this season were killed in the attack. Just to give like perspective, right? 36 people were killed, 34 were injured. KyoAni at its peak has had about 200 employees. So you're approaching about half the people were affected directly and are killed by the attack. Or everyone was affected directly. Half of the people were either killed or injured. This attack is one of the deadliest massacres in modern Japanese history. And its aftermath did see an overwhelming flood of love and support for KyoAni, its art, and its people, and that support came both domestically within Japan and from around the entire world. It's why people probably have heard of it, because, you know, like Disney was doing fundraisers for it. Like the entire animation community around the world Like different political figures, like the Prime Minister of Canada, I know, would like talked about it and was trying to raise support for it. Within Japan, they passed like a specific act within the Diet to make it so that all the donations would be tax-free, so that 100% of the donations could go to the victims of and their families. So it was, awful tragedy, but it did see like this incredible wave of support. And obviously that also came with all the reporting, which really kind of reinforced a lot of the research I was able to do for this season. It is horrifically
and I mean,
tragic.
just worth saying also that like violence like this is so rare in Japan. Violence on this scale is just, I mean, in most countries in the world, we're very numb to it in the U.S. because we have horrible, horrible policies. But this is just the kind of thing that, I mean, it's a real earthquake, and it was something that I think was a shock in a million different directions. But yeah, just to underline that.
And if people want to know more about that, there is a really good Hollywood Reporter article that was written around the time that if you just Google that for that, you can find it. It's a really well-sourced. It's something I use for some of my research because it also goes a little bit into the history of KyoAni and stuff as well. So if people are curious about hearing more around that attack and learning more about it, that's where you could go. So one thing I want to say here is like, it's horribly tragic, obviously, that this attack happened at all, but it's even more pointedly tragic to me that this happened to a studio whose art is filled with such love and humanity, and also whose business practices are lauded within the industry for being humane and equitable, with the anime industry being very well known for being neither of those things. And KyoAni is like this kind of shining light within the industry, showing what like the best possible practices are currently, and like what that can do both for the health of the employees and for the quality of the art that you create. And so I'm incredibly excited that we get to celebrate the work of KyoAni throughout the season. And I want this season to be positive and optimistic in its approach, because that reflects, I think, a lot of the attitude we'll see in the shows we watch. But unfortunately, this attack and the effects of it are going to be part of our conversation throughout the season, particularly in the history sections, because again, there are lots and lots of really important people, whether they're, people who had only started at KyoAni for 3 months or people who had been working there for like 20 years, died in that attack. So it's going to come up all the time. So I just want people to know about it at the top, that, this is the thing that happened. It's a tragedy. And it's kind of something that's unavoidable, even if I don't want it to be a thing that like dominates every single discussion or anything. Obviously, when we get to the very end of the season, Violet Evergarden, the movie, was in production when the attack happened. So that will be the time when it will become like most relevant specifically to the actual production of what we're going to be looking at. We'll talk about it even more in depth once we get to there.
And I second all of that. So absolutely. All
right. So let's go ahead and get into then the main thrust of the history of Kyoto Animation. Here's my sort of like, little intro at the top here. Kyoto Animation was co-founded by the married couple of animator and artist Hata Yoko and accountant Hata Hideaki, 1985. One note here, because I did so much of my research in Japanese, it became confusing for me. I just left all the names in Japanese name order because it was just a lot easier. So all these names, if you prefer the English name order, just flip them in your head. It was easier for me doing my research to just simplify it and make it more consistent across everything because it was constantly switching. So those were the two founders, Hata Yoko and Hata Hideaki. Kyoto Animation's first productions were 2003's in terms of their full productions. Were 2003's Full Metal Panic Fumofu and the OVA Munto. Though their first fully independent production is 2005's Air, the first thing we'll be watching. So the question becomes, how does a small studio that was founded by a family in 1985 come to independently produce anime 20 years later and then become one of the most important, successful, influential, and beloved anime production studios in the world? Well, let's find out, because it's going to have to start even earlier than 1985. I have separated my notes here into sections in order to help me organize it. Section 1 here is called Toei Doga, Mushi Production, and the Roots of Kyoto Animation, because we are having to start all the way at the beginning.
I was going to say, Toei Doga Mushi Pro is also just the roots of Japanese animation.
Yes.
So, or of at least of what we call anime. So that's about as far back as you can go for this thing.
And that's how it starts here. So the founder of KyoAni, Hata Yoko's maiden name is Sugiyama Yoko. She is the younger sister of animator Sugiyama Taku, and Sugiyama Taku is in so many ways where the story of KyoAni starts. So Sugiyama Taku was a 19-year-old art student who was attempting to get into the Tokyo University of the Arts in 1956 when his and Yoko's older sister saw an advertisement by film company Toei looking to hire artists. She told him, and this is all from Taku's blog, quote, "Rather than going to school, wouldn't this be way better? Why don't you apply?" Thinking that there was no way he would actually pass, Sugiyama applied, and to his shock, he was accepted. And Sugiyama ended up being one of 9 people hired, and he became part of the first generation of animators hired by the new subsidiary Toei had just established called Toei Doga. Toei Doga is the predecessor to the modern Toei Animation, and is one of the first major animation companies ever in Japan.
Wow. So he's one of the first 9 people hired for the division.
Yes. Yeah.
That's wild.
They obviously already had people that when they created the division, they already had people. But in terms of the people that they like hired in terms of like a recruitment drive, he was one of the first 9 people to get accepted. And there was like 100 something plus people that applied, and he was one of the only 9 to be accepted.
Well, because this is a huge moment. So, there is Japanese animation before the war. I think generally we don't call it anime because it has not kind of taken on the style that we come to know. You can call it anime, you can call it whatever you want. But there had never really been a full effort to have a actual Japanese studio, like one of the big studios like a Toei, come in and kind of have animation. Some of the different studios in the pre-war era had animators, but they mostly did stuff like intertitles for silent films, and they would maybe do some independent animations on the side. And Toei, which is the newest of the ones at the time, Toei is kind of the new kid on the block among the older companies like Shochiku and whatnot, and this is one of their big post-war efforts, is to do this animation push and try to compete with sort of like Disney on the international scale. And so there's just a lot of animators who got their start here, but also right about that time, kind of in the same way she's talking about here in that blog post of like seeing that recruitment drive and being wowed by it. Miyazaki Hayao talks about this too, of like just the excitement of like, hey, there was this company that was like looking for fresh young artists, and this was exciting. And Hakujaden, their first movie, The White Snake Enchantress, was like, they would go to the theater and see this and be like, oh, Japanese people made this? This is crazy. And it was a huge inflection point for people at the time thinking, oh, this isn't just something that other countries do, we can do it.
Yeah, exactly. And Sugiyama Taku was one of the first people to be a part of that. So, yeah, so you were just like covering some of the stuff I was going to say. They created the first Japanese animated feature in color, which is Hakujaden, also known as The White Snake Enchantress, 1958. Off the success of that film, Toei Doga made animated features every year. And so Sugiyama did animation on their first 5 films. And he started out just doing animation. At a certain point, I think after the second movie, he also started doing like kind of directed a small group of animators that were under him, because this is so early that you didn't have like a clearly defined production cycle, right? Like you didn't have, okay, here are all the official titles for all of these roles and how this is organized in a company, because it was so early on. So he just described it in his blog as being like, oh, this was like the Sugiyama Gumi, like the Sugiyama group. It was like 5 or 6 people that he kind of managed in doing animation. And so he did those first 5 movies: Hakujaden, Tanuki-san Ochi, Shonen Sarutobi Sasuke, also known as Magic Boy, Sayuki, or Journey to the West, and Anju Tozushi Yomaru, also known as the Orphan Brother. One other note here, this is going to be important later on. Amongst the other 8 members of that first generation, there are lots of really important people in the history of anime. For the history of KyoAni, there's one other one that's really important, and that is Kusube Daikichiro. Kusube had tremendous success at Toei Doga. He rose to the position of animation director, but he left to form his own company in 1965. He formed a company called A Production that mostly worked with Tokyo Movie Shinsha, or TMS. A Production came up when we did Lupin the Third Part 1, because they worked on that when the director switch happened. So when Miyazaki and Takahata came in, if you remember, Jonathan, their official credit was like A Production Group is what that direction was. And that's because this is around when A Production came in. In 1976, A Production changed its name to Shine Animation, which is what it still has today. And in 1979, Shine created the still-running anime version of Doraemon, and the rest is, as they say, history. They also make Cran Shinchan. If you are Japan, this is the company that like made your childhood, basically, is what Shine Animation is. Put a pin in Shine Animation. That is going to come up again later. So
it is so funny. I mean, so many of these people come from that same moment where, like, because Toei also gets pretty shitty in their production practices and sends a lot of people kind of fleeing for the hills who make studios like this that then go on to change the course of anime history. So
precisely. So back to Sugiyama. So Sugiyama left Toei Doga in 1962 in order to go back and actually attend that art school he had never gone to. And after graduating from art school, he started working on a series called Dolphin Prince, which he was involved in the creation of. And then at that point, Sugiyama was personally invited by Tezuka Osamu to join Mushi Production in 1965. Tezuka Osamu is, of course, the creator of Astro Boy. He's commonly called the father of manga. And then Mushi Production is the other, like, pivotal and important studio in the creation of modern-day anime, in particular on the TV production side. Like, Mushi Production is, like, there at the very beginning. Is that a fair description, Jonathan?
Yeah, Mushi Pro is the one that kind of, there were attempts at doing TV, what Mushi Pro did, and there is a lot of debate whether it was a good thing or a bad thing.
Yeah.
They figured out the formula for how to do it weekly, and that was a mix of using sort of limited animation techniques so they didn't have to make too many frames, but also finding sponsors and having your sponsor cards and stuff so you could get the show out every week, and that is what kind of kicked off what we now know as TV anime.
Very good. So, Sugiyama had met Tezuka when he was working on the Toei Doga movie Journey to the West, because Tezuka was making a Sun Wukong or Monkey King manga at the same time, and through that connection, they ended up meeting each other. And Tezuka had been very impressed with Sugiyama's work. Also, Sugiyama's wife had worked at Mushi Production temporarily, and that was part of it. Like, there's a whole long thing in his blog where he goes over it. Anyways, Sugiyama joins Mushi Production as a director, and he directs the 1965 TV series Wonder 3. He worked on a bunch of other projects there. One of the other ones he was the main director on was 1968 series Animal 1. He also did later go on to co-direct with Tezuka himself the movie Phoenix 2772, which is one of the adaptations of Tezuka's like really famous manga, The Phoenix. So obviously Sugiyama, a very impressive dude if he's getting handpicked by fucking Tezuka Osamu to go join Mushi Production. So while Sugiyama was working at Mushi Pro, that's when his younger sister, and this is where this all starts to come together, Sugiyama Yoko, graduated from high school. And around 1965, she told her brother, I also want to start working in animation. So using his connections, Sugiyama got his sister Yoko a job doing finish animation, or what's called shiage in Japanese. Finish animation is the process by which the images drawn by the animator are traced onto the transparent cell sheets they use and then are colored in. It's primarily like a painting job, and she was a painter. So this is where Yoko learned the animation production process. This is also where she developed her skills as an artist/painter. However, she quickly found it very difficult for her to actually advance at Mushi Pro, so she ended up leaving the company, and she got a job outside the industry, and due to circumstances related to that new job she got, she ended up moving to the Kyoto region. And that obviously, by the name of Kyoto Animation, is a really important part of the story, is her going down to Kyoto.
I see the clues. I see it all coming together, Sean.
Yes, this is the process of me doing the research. It's like it all connects. Oh my god.
I'm imagining you as Charlie in It's Always Sunny, just with all the connections up there on the board, like it's all connected.
That basically is what it was like. So this begins the next section of my notes here, which I call Founding Kyoto Anime Studio in the 1980s. So while in Kyoto, Sugiyama Yoko met Hata Hideaki, who was an accountant who worked for a railway company, and in 1975, Yoko and Hideaki were married. By 1980, Yoko and Hideaki were raising 3 children when they began discussing the prospect of starting their own business, and they ended up seeing animation as a prime opportunity. This is where the genius of Kyoto Animation comes in. They identified 4 critical reasons that this animation venture would be successful. First, in 1980, the anime boom of the 80s was just beginning, right? This is 1 year after Mobile Suit Gundam. This is like the Gundam movies starting to come out. So all that kind of connects to that point in time. And they both saw the need in the industry for additional labor as more and more production was being outsourced. Second, the vast majority of anime production was centered around the Tokyo area. So there was a massive untapped labor market in Kyoto in the Kansai region that they could use. Third, Yoko had her Mushi production experience and her family connections in the industry that she could use. And then fourth, Yoko also had connections to some of the local housewives in the area. And she knew that finish animation, which is just painting, was something that these women who had a desire to work but also needed to spend a lot of time at home with their kids could complete at home after they were trained to do so. And that last one is the key part here.
Well, and I just want to say, this is also something in cell animation around the world. These finishing jobs did tend to go to women. This is something that, like, this is true of Disney, this is true of Warner Brothers, and places around the world, is that sort of those final pieces would often be delegated to sort of the women on the staff, and it was also a way that they had trouble sort of rising up through the industries, that those people were often uncredited. We don't often know who these people were. We know they existed because someone had to do the work. But so it kind of makes sense that a woman would have come out of this, and that then she would kind of see that not as like something to exploit, but maybe something to actually build on as a foundation.
Yeah, and like use it as, exactly the foundation of this new company they're making. So in 1981, Yoko began training 3 of the housewives in her neighborhood, Honda Emiko, Fujimura Akiko, and Takimura Ayako, in how to do Finnish animation. And then she and her husband also started advertising this workshop with ads stating, quote, "We teach painting." And they quickly started building up a larger network of people, predominantly women, whom Yoko was teaching how to paint. At the same time, Yoko reached out to her brother, Sugiyama Taku, and told him that she wanted to work in animation again and asked if he could help her. Sugiyama connected her with his old colleague from the Toei Doga days, Kusube Daikichiro. So do you remember that Shine pin? Take that out, because this is where it comes up. By this point, Kusube was the president and founder of Shine Animation, and their Doraemon series, which had just started in 1979, was already becoming a national sensation. Shine's tremendous success also meant that they were in constant need of additional labor to capitalize on that success, so Kusube agreed to outsource some of the Finnish animation of Doraemon to this new workshop that Yoko was establishing. As the workshop took off in 1981, it needed a name, and the Hatas decided to call it the Kyoto Anime Studio. And from 1981 to 1985, the Kyoto Anime Studio began to expand, hiring more people, and they also began working with another major studio, who's also going to be important. This is another pin, Tatsunoko Productions, which is one of the other like super old 1960s black and white era TV anime studios. By 1985, this loose workshop model of Kyoto Anime Studio was no longer tenable for the volume of business they were doing, so the Hatas decided they needed to officially incorporate as a company, and to help with this, Yoko reached out to her older sister. This is the same one that had encouraged Sugiyama Taku to apply to Toei Doga, because her sister also had experience as an accountant working at a major pharmaceutical company, and she had experience doing business at a much, much bigger scale than her husband Hideaki as a railway accountant had. So this sister helped the Hatas navigate that process of incorporation. When they officially incorporated in 1985, they changed the name from Kyoto Anime Studio to simply Kyoto Animation, and they placed Hata Hideaki as president and Hata Yoko as vice president, roles which they both serve today. The partnership is split like this. Hideaki is the one who's focused on the business end of the company. He's the one who deals with the clients, he manages the money, he deals with advertising, that kind of stuff. Yoko is the one who's in charge of the creative side. She chooses which projects they work on, and she's the one who manages the artists. Yoko has specifically a producer credit on everything that we're covering this season, and based on my research, that credit is she is actually working on the production. It's not I'm the one who owns the company, so I get a producer credit, kind of producer credit, which we all know is something that sometimes happens. But she seems to actually be very hands-on, or at least has been historically. While the Kyoto Anime Studio of the early 80s specialized in Finnish animation, by 1986, Kyoto Animation had established a full animation department and an art department, and they were performing a wide variety of tasks, including in-betweens, background art, key animation, etc., as a subcontractor in the industry. Notably, Kyoto Animation performed substantial work with one of their major clients, Tatsunoko Production, on the series Red Photon Zillion. Tatsunoko was struggling at the time, and so the producer of the show, Hishikawa Mitsuhisa, established a branch office to try to develop the show, but he struggled to fully produce it because he had a lack of staff and budget. After the fact, producer Ishikawa has stated that Kyoto Animation was entrusted with developing and producing a majority of the show. So some people nowadays, while it's fairly uncredited, argue that Zillion is in some ways Kyoto Animation's actual first production. As an interesting side note, I love this detail. After Zillion, Ishikawa Mitsuhisa and many of the staff from the branch office that worked on that show left Tatsunoko, and they founded a new studio called IG Tatsunoko. IG Tatsunoko changed its name to Production IG in 2005. Anime fans should be familiar with Production IG because they are the people who make Ghost in the Shell, the movies and the show, Psycho-Pass, Haikyuu, and like a billion other really great shows. When Ishikawa was establishing IG Tatsunoko, the president of Kyoto Animation, Hata Hideaki, invested in the company, and he was one of the initial shareholders of Production IG. And my favorite detail of all, according to Sugiyama Taku on his blog, his and Yoko's older sister, the one that had recommended that Sugiyama join Toei Doga, the one who's helped establish the finances of Kyoto Animation, also helped with the financial logistics of establishing IG Tatsunoko. And I love that there is some lady who's totally anonymous, her name's not public, she's, an accountant or whatever that works in the pharmaceutical business, who is like the Palpatine of the anime industry and is vital in installing this guy who was a major animator on all of the early Toei Doga movies and one of the key directors at fucking Mushi Pro. She's one of the ones who was involved in making sure that Kyoto Animation got off the ground and that fucking Production IG happened. If this older Sugiyama sibling wasn't doing all this shit, maybe Ghost in the Shell would have fucking never come out. It's crazy.
Fucking wild. I'm very into all of this, Sean. One thing I just wanted to mention, this kind of sparked, and I went and checked in some of my notes to see if this was a false memory or not, but it's true. Did you know a lot of the main base for animation in Japan before the war was actually Kyoto? That is where that's where most animation happened. Masaoka Kenzo, who is probably the most famous pre-war animator, him and like Seo Mitsuyo, his animation production was in Kyoto. Several others did stuff there. The Kyoto Municipal School of Arts and Crafts is where several people learned their craft. I'm just going back through my notes, and this is where it was not really based in Tokyo. A lot of animation stuff happened over in Kyoto, and then obviously that shifted to Tokyo after the war, particularly with Toei doing what they did. But there's a rich history of animation in Kyoto, just kind of before we called it anime.
Interesting, yeah. So it left to go to Tokyo, and then the Hattas brought it back.
Yes. I just love the idea of this fucking power couple who were just like building on like the power of housewives and suburban living down in Kyoto to be like, let's change the world. And it's great.
Yeah, I mean, their business strategy stuff, which a lot of this is I pulled from that Hollywood Reporter article I mentioned earlier from after the arson attack happened. There's a lot of interviews with Hatta Hideaki. The Hattas and a lot of KyoAni staff are pretty famously like, they don't give interviews very often. They're not as like sort of out there as some other people involved in the production of animation. And so it's pretty rare you actually find a direct interview with them. Most of my stuff is pulled from other sources or from like Tsukiyama Taku has a blog where he goes into all this stuff, and it's fucking great. If you can read Japanese, look up his blog. It's fucking amazing. But like that interview, he talks about some of this, like this was our plan and how we kind of thought through the logistics of how this could be a successful business. And it's so fucking smart. And it will continue to pay dividends as we move into our next section here, where it really starts coming together. So this next section I called KyoAni in the 90s, Gross Uke and New Faces. This is also where I had to learn a lot of new terms in Japanese for some of this stuff. So by 1991, KyoAni established a photography or a satsue department. Photography in anime is like when you're compositing the elements and filming them. It's not like going outside and taking pictures for reference or something like that. And that photography thing was the last piece that they needed to be able to create complete full finished animation projects on their own, like independent of anybody else. And this took a critical next step for the studio, which was taking on what is called gross uke work. I do not know if there is an equivalent animation term for this in English because I looked for a long time. I'm just going to call it gross uke, and I'll explain it in a second. To give context,
I'll try to tell you once I know what it is. I have no idea just looking at the word or the kanji here.
Yes.
It's literally and it is, just so people know, it is gurosu in katakana. Yes. So it is the English word gross, and then it is kanji.
Yeah.
This is making me laugh.
Yeah, I'll break all this down for you. So to give context, and okay, before I get to this, gross uke has its own fucking Japanese Wikipedia page. So I was shocked. I'd never heard of any of this shit. To give context for KyoAni's production process in the 90s and why the model that they developed later in the 2000s is really remarkable, let's briefly review the basics of how anime production works. So originally, anime production studios like Mushi Pro handled the entire production process, but that was quickly found to be too strenuous on the workers and too inefficient. Like some people literally died when they made Astro Boy because the work conditions were so severe. So pretty quickly, these studios realized we cannot do this. So they developed a distributed production model where one studio, the primary contractor, or what is referred to as moto uke in Japanese, led the development of the project, and then they distributed various elements of the workload to other companies, which were the subcontractors or outsourcing. This is referred to as shita uke in Japanese. At that point, many animation studios were developed to operate specifically as subcontractors, and that's what KyoAni was, right? They were just, originally, we just handle finish animation, and then they started tacking on more tasks, but all they did was, here's like Shine doing Doraemon, they contract out this section of these episodes to KyoAni, and they make those and send it back. Within that system, the more experienced and robust subcontracted studios ended up being used for what's called gross uke work. Gross uke is a term that comes from, as you're saying, Jonathan, the English word gross, as in like gross domestic product, so all or the whole, and then the Japanese term uke, which means to receive, but in this specific context, it means to contract out, right? So moto uke is like the primary contractor, shita uke means literally subcontractor, gross uke is like whole contract, so you could kind of describe it. So gross uke refers to the practice of the primary contractor or the main production studio on a project assigning a subcontractor to complete the entire production of a single episode. So this one studio does the storyboards, the background art, key animation, in-betweens, compositing, finishing, all that is just done by this animation studio, like KyoAni. The only exception is they don't do things like they don't write the scripts, they don't record the music, the voices, the sound effects, all that stuff is still handled either by the main production studio or another studio that they had subcontracted out to do that for the whole project. So this gross uke work, where KyoAni makes an entire episode, like, oh, we're just going to make this Doraemon episode and then send it back. That would become a staple of KyoAni's output in the 90s. And many notable anime studios were established through this exact process I learned as I went through. They start as a subcontractor, working on smaller elements of larger projects. They upgrade their production pipeline to be able to create full episodes in the gross uke model. And then if they're very successful there, eventually those studios become their own primary contractors developing projects that then they use and hire out and outsource elements of that work to other subcontracting studios. And that's like the life cycle of a successful anime studio in Japan. So many of the modern anime studios that aren't like Toei Animation or go back that far, most of them were developed in this way. Notably,
and this is like, we've talked about this with like when we did Lupin the Third Part 2.
Yes.
We talked about the various studios, because especially with a show that is like weekly for years, you'll generally cycle through studios. You'll hear this, people talk about this with Dragon Ball and Dragon Ball Z all the time. Which studio did which episodes, because they made one a week for 10 years. Yes. So who did what? And I will also say, I don't know what the term for this is in America. This is how most American animation is just done on TV. Like The Simpsons is scripted and recorded in the United States, but it is entirely animated in South Korea by a company called Klasky Ksupo. And they did Rugrats back in the day. This is just how it's kind of standardly done in America. Japan, if anything, the difference is that there's more studios that are actually hands-on domestically.
Yeah, I think that's probably like one of the reasons why this term is more this like concept creates this specific term in Japan, is because it's like, well, there is animation that is handled domestically commonly, right? Because it's not like Toei Animation contracts every episode of Dragon Ball Z to someone else. They do have in-house people that do work on the show. And that's like one of the main differences, whereas you say most Western animation, it's like literally everything is handled by this other studio. And it's extremely rare that the actual animating process of part of an episode is done by someone in that studio in California or wherever they're based out of. So that's probably why this is a specific term that is kind of developed within the industry in Japan. One thing that's really notable, though, here, and where KyoAni differs from that normal life cycle, is that eventually KyoAni, when they develop their own projects, they return basically to that independent model of anime production from the 60s. They just have a much better managed and more equitable production process that allows that style to actually work. And so the production pipeline that KyoAni developed and was refined through this whole gross uke thing they did in the 90s was essential to their ability to create effectively independent productions in 2005 and onwards. Because even more so than Ufotable, if you look at the credits for their shows, they use fewer outsourced studios, and it's always, and I'll talk about it later, like it's always one or two studios that they use for like background, and it's almost entirely in-house. And so they're kind of separated from the rest of that system once they get through the 90s. So as KyoAni enters the 90s here, another thing I want to talk about outside the production process is that there are several major figures that joined the company at this time that we're going to be visiting throughout the season, and I want to talk about a few of them. So throughout this whole season, almost everything that we're going to be looking at is going to be directed by one of three people: Ishihara Tatsuya, Takemoto Yasuhiro, and Yamada Naoko. Of those three, two of them, Takemoto and Ishihara, join at this point in KyoAni's history. Yamada Naoko joins later in the 2000s. We'll talk about her when we get to the point that she comes on. But Ishihara Tatsuya, he joined Kyoto Animation in 1987 as an animator, and by 1991 and 92, he shifted primarily to being an episode director of what we are covering this season. He's director or co-director on Air, Kanon, Clannad, so everything for our first part here is all Ishihara. He is the director or co-director on all of Haruhi. He's the main director on Nichijou, and he's co-director on the Sound Euphonium series. So like over half of everything we're doing is him, either as the director or the co-director. The other major director from this period is Takemoto Yasuhiro. He joined in 92 as an animator, and he worked his first job as an animation director in 97. Takemoto would work regularly as an animation director and episode director at KyoAni throughout the late 90s and early 2000s. One thing that separates Ishihara and Takemoto is that Ishihara, once he stops doing animation work and moves to being a director, he mostly just stays as a director. Takemoto switches between directing and being a key animator on projects throughout the whole work at KyoAni. Of what we are covering this season, he is the director or co-director on Lucky Star, on Haruhi Season 2. He is the director on Disappearance of Haruhi, and he is the main director of Hyoka. Tragically, Takimoto is one of the people who was killed in that arson attack. So his last show he worked on was Miss Kobayashi-san's Maid Dragon, Season 1, and he had been killed by the time they made Season 2. Both Ishihara and Takimoto were born and raised in the Kansai region, with Ishihara specifically being a Kyoto native. And so this is exactly part of the hottest business plan, getting these like really talented young artists. This shows the fruits of KyoAni's strategy, because their choices at the time in the late 80s/early 90s was either move to Tokyo and work at one of those studios, or like go down the street and work with those guys. And it's like, you know, you get to stay home and you get to work on this stuff. It was a good deal. So they worked at KyoAni.
And good deal for everyone else, because it's like, it is so true, where you work matters. And like, it's just because the center of business is in Tokyo doesn't mean there aren't talented people elsewhere who might just never get there unless you find them. So it's really cool.
Yeah, and Ishihara, I'll note, is still there. Like, he's still working at KyoAni. And obviously Takimoto worked there until his death. So there is a very, very high level of employee retainment in KyoAni. Even more critical, though, than Ishihara and Takimoto joining the company, who at this point, they were still like a decade away from becoming the series directors that we know them as, was KyoAni hiring a veteran in the industry who could shape all the new young talent that was joining there, and thus enter a person I had never heard about before I started doing this research, but is one of the most important people at KyoAni, and this is animator Kigami Yoshiji. And I cannot tell you how many times I read the word tensai, or genius, when I was researching this guy. And I've got some links here, Jonathan, as we talk through this, that you can click on to see some examples of stuff he animated here. And if people are curious, you can just look him up on Sakuga Boru, and that's where I pulled all the GIFs. I have linked in my notes that people can see some of his stuff there. So in 1991, the legendary animator Kigami Yoshiji joined KyoAni. He was renowned at the time already for having worked on projects like the Doraemon movies. He worked on the Crayon Shinchan movies. He worked on Macross Do You Remember Love? He worked on Grave of the Fireflies. He worked on Akira. I mean, he worked on fucking everything. That was like a lot of like the big names that specifically pointed out of things I knew that I had seen, or Jonathan had seen, or everyone knows of Doraemon.
That's just, you're just like going down a list of the best animated movies of the 1980s. I just think that's hilarious. It's just like, what are all the like most renowned pieces of animation of the decade? It's hilarious. I'm looking at his clip from Macross, and that, if you haven't seen, is one of the best animated movies ever. And wow.
Yeah, he's really fucking good at what he did. Incidentally, also, KyoAni was, and this has nothing to do with Kigami, but they were involved in all those projects other than Grave of the Fireflies. So they were a subcontract studio. They worked on Macross. They worked on Akira. I mean, they worked on all the Doraemon and Crayon Shinchan stuff because they were so much with Shine. But yes, KyoAni was everywhere in the late 80s and early 90s. They worked on fucking everything. So Kigami, back to him, he started as an animator at Shine Animation in 1979. He rose to an animation director position within 2 years. And based on the interview I was reading, the person said that it normally took someone 8 to 10 years to rise to that position. It took Kigami 2. And he was one of the animation directors on the TV series Kaibutsu-kun. After Kaibutsu-kun ended, Kigami left Shine in 1982 with 7 other high-profile animators who are all led by Kigami's mentor, who was Honda Toshiyuki. Honda was a key animator who worked on like everything. Specifically, he worked on Lupin the Third Part 1. I noticed in his credits, he was also one of the key animators on Hoshi no Kyojin and like a bunch of the other like classic late 60s, early 70s anime. And all of those animators together formed an animation company called Animaria. Or Animal House is what that literally translates to. And this is exactly that subcontracting thing we were just talking about. They were just a little company, independent company of animators that they're like, hey, you hire us, we will do animation for whatever project that you're working on. And he was regarded as a genius by many of his peers, though Kigami was noted that he never liked being called that. And it was said of him by other animators at the time, this is a specific quote, that, quote, there is nothing that Kigami cannot draw, which is a pretty high piece of praise for other animators to give you. Kigami was frequently requested by name for the projects he worked on. I know for sure that Otomo specifically requested him to work on Akira. We know that he did like a lot of water stuff, especially in the early days. So there's some like water stuff in Akira that he was brought on to animate. There's one of the Doraemon movies, there's like a giant flood scene. That's one of the things that he did. So he was like particularly good at that, as well as drawing people, which is obviously the thing that's going to come up with KyoAni. In 1990, Kigami left Animaria, or Animal House, which was stationed in Tokyo, because he wanted to help take care of his mother, who lived in Osaka. For people who don't know, Osaka is in the Kansai region, and it's very close to Kyoto. It was the next year then, in 1991, that Kigami joined KyoAni, and Kigami became KyoAni's most reliable key animator and episode director. According to many, his prodigious skill and influence were critical to KyoAni's movement to independent production. Specifically, I have a quote from Kamiyuto Tatsuo, who was an animator at KyoAni who worked in the 90s there. And he said, quote, "The road to becoming the primary studio for anime that brings the whole project together was difficult and intimidating. However, furnished with the incredible ability and talent of Kigami, a vision of the future suddenly opened up." Kigami's role at the studio was not simply as an animator, but he was also a mentor. Kigami helped train the other animators, and his influence and ability to draw complex emotion and character through subtle but expressive movement began to establish a distinctive style for KyoAni, which the studio had lacked up till that point. KyoAni director Takemoto Yasuhiro, who we were just talking about, the director of Hyoka and stuff like that, said that when he was starting out, he and the other junior animators would wait for Kigami to clock out for the day, and then they would go take the drawings that he had thrown away and they would study those, which was a great anecdote I saw. Kigami's philosophy was, quote, "Don't compromise, push yourself through." He was known to change things and add embellishments even when he was just a junior animator at Shine, and he often advocated for people to trust and express their own creative vision. Kigami preferred to work behind the scenes, and he was often credited under pseudonyms, and this will be true for all the stuff we look at. I don't think for any KyoAni main project he was ever credited as his own name. He is typically credited as Tada Fumio for key animation, and Miyoshi Ichiro when he's the episode director on something. He preferred animating rather than directing, and he often said, "There are a lot more interesting staff than me, so I just can't be the director." That being said, Kigami did direct some projects for KyoAni. He directed the three-part special Noroi no One Piece, which I'll talk about in a sec. He directed the Munto series, and he was also the director on a very delightful OVA in 2017 called Baja no Studio. Tragically, this is where I have to say, Kigami is one of the people who was killed in that arson attack. He died at the age of 61, and he was survived by his wife, who is also an employee of Kyoto Animation. It was reported that at the wake, Kyoto Animation president Hata Hideaki told Kigami's grieving mother that Kigami had been the greatest animator in all of Japan.
This is so sad.
Yeah.
But also so cool to learn about this guy who had just what a fucking influence. You look at all of that. I mean, it reminds me a lot of someone like, and talking about like the teaching role as something so important, because animation is such an apprentice kind of based system. It also reminds me a lot of what we talked about with Yasuo Otsuka on Lupin, of like his influence isn't just in the cuts, it isn't just in the animation you look at, it's in the generations of animators who learned from this person who was skilled at communicating what was needed to do the work. And people like that, you know, and that's another person who didn't direct, but their influence is as big as any director when you look at the lineage going on down.
Yeah, Yasuo Otsuka was the exact person I thought of when I was reading about Kigami, of like, oh yeah, this is one of those guys that like, when you're just watching the shows and you're doing like a cursory amount of research, their name's never going to pop up because they're so behind the scenes. But he's so critical. And so I'll definitely try to, as we go through the shows, because he usually directs at least 1 or 2 episodes per show. And there's one in particular, Nichijou. He directs the episode, for people who have seen Nichijou, where the principal wrestles the deer. It's probably the most famous clip from that show. He was the director on that episode. So I'll try to point it out when I know, oh, here's like a Kigami thing that popped up. But like the nature of the work is he's so behind the scenes that it's not as evident. And that's one of the reasons I wanted to give his whole spiel here. You know, we'll go deeper in on those other directors when we talk about their shows. Like I've already written up a whole big thing with Ishihara that I cut from this because I'm like, we'll talk about that on the actual air episode. But this is where I wanted to give Kigami some space to really talk about him, because clearly like he was so essential to defining KyoAni. And again, he worked there from when he was hired in 1991 all the way up till his death in 2019. So, you know, and someone who had bounced around to a bunch of different studios early in his career. And he just like got settled in at KyoAni and stayed, which is the story you see from so many of these people.
And could have worked anywhere, sounded like it, given how in demand he was. So, yeah.
Exactly. So back to our timeline then. So we've got all those people who are being hired now. By the early 90s, KyoAni enjoyed a reputation for doing excellent work, and they were greatly in demand. KyoAni worked on many high-profile projects. I mean, they worked on everything. They even worked on Studio Ghibli films like Porco Rosso and Kiki's Delivery Service. I noticed when I was looking at their credits around this time. One quote I love here, according to director Sugi Gizaburo, who is an animation director who worked on a lot of stuff, he said that the demand for KyoAni's work was so high at the time that animation studios would sometimes adjust their schedules so that KyoAni could work for them. So instead of them being like, oh, we're making the show, what's a studio that could work on episode 10? They're like, oh shit, we want KyoAni to work on episode 10. Let's push this back a couple of weeks so that their schedule can align, which is just an incredible fucking anecdote. So they were really in demand at this point. However, KyoAni was also slowly beginning to seek out ways that they could develop their own original projects. This is a weird one. This took a while for me to find. Weirdly, their first original production was a short film in 1991 called Shiaose te Nani, or What is Happiness, which is a promotional video financed by the infamous Happy Science cult, which people might have heard of before. If you've seen Mob Psycho 100, they parody the Happy Science cult. They are like, it's a weird cult all about like the power of happiness and that being happy will spread happiness to other people. It's kind of like, what's that fucking dumb like thing? We watched a video of it, The Secret. That's it.
The
it's
Secret,
kind of like,
the Oprah Book Club thing. Yeah, that's like,
yes,
yeah.
It's The Secret, but like even more culty, like even more organized as like an actual cult thing. It's kind of crazy. They were not so infamous when this weird short was made, and it was.
Are they like a cult who hurts people, or they're just relentlessly positive?
You know, it's hard to know. I mean, they're a cult. Like it's like I don't know enough about them to know how deep the bad parts of it go, but it's not good.
Yeah, I guess there's no good version of a cult. At least it's the happy cult. I don't know, but yeah, I am looking at the video now. Let's just say it does not look like KyoAni's later work.
No, yes. I mean, this was, you can find this on YouTube very easily. I have a link for you, Jonathan, so you can see it. If you just look it up, you can find it. It's very bad, but if people are curious, you can check it out. My one sentence synopsis for it is, in Shiaose te Nani, a young boy learns the secret to happiness when a little angel girl teaches him how to touch his golden ball. Because that's what that short is all about.
And also, the version you have has very funny, it must be like a machine translation or something. There's this part where the phone rings and the mom goes, "It's phone." Goes and gets it. So if you want bad subtitles for a bad happiness cult story, there you go.
Yeah, honestly, it's a miracle that this thing is fucking available anywhere. Like, I was shocked when I fucking found it. I mean, I was shocked when I learned that it existed and shocked that I could actually see it. And I did watch it, but it's fucking awful. I do want to give a shout out to the YouTube user Mikhail, who had a comment that I just lost my shit when I read on the YouTube video where he just described it as a cult classic, which is so fucking good. The other detail here that I think is just incredible is that this short, Shiaose te Nani, was directed by Ishihara Tatsuya, the guy who's directing almost half of the stuff we're watching. This is technically his directorial debut, but if you look him up, most websites you find will understandably not cite this, and instead they cite a 1992 episode of Doraemon that he directed as his actual directorial debut. But technically, it was What is Happiness for the Happy Science cult. What a weird fucking thing. This was one of the weirder alleys I ended up in when I was doing research for this episode.
I'm imagining Ishihara Tatsuya himself in his off hours at the computer, like altering Wikipedia to be like, no, my debut was Doraemon. Everyone loves Doraemon. Doraemon never hurt anybody.
Yeah. It would be like if you found out that, like, Rian Johnson's first thing that he directed was like a weird like S&M porn or something, or like, and he's just like trying to make sure that nobody ever finds out about it. Anyways, so that's Shiaose te Nani, another early kind of pseudo-independent production they made in 1992. Kigami Yoshiji himself directed the 3-part horror series called Noroi no One Piece. These are basically a series of like 7-minute shorts that were all cut together in this like TV special that was like a bunch of different shorts of different things all edited into a show. And this was contracted out to them by Shinei Animation. While Shinei is technically the production studio, all the actual production studios were performed by Kyoto Animation, making this one of their earliest complete productions, even more so than something like Zillion. This was like just KyoAni made these things, because again, they're like, it's like 21 minutes of animation total across the 3 pieces. These can be found if you look for them online. They're okay. Like, the animation is really good. The stories are kind of whatever. Episode 3 is the one I think that is quite good. If people want to check it out, just want to watch one quick 7-minute horror thing, the 3rd episode of Noroi no One Piece, and that translates to The Cursed One Piece, is quite good.
This was about the last time you could use the term One Piece and not mean the pirate thing, huh?
Yes, it's a cursed dress is what the One Piece is. It's a One Piece dress that keeps on showing up to these girls. And it's the kind of thing where like they throw it away and it shows up in their closet again the next day. It's creepy. It's good stuff. Here's something I couldn't find, and I'm fucking torn up that I couldn't find these. I don't know why I can find What is Happiness, but not these. KyoAni also made 3 OVAs in the 90s. OVA is probably the wrong word for it, just PSAs. That they were for, I translate this as the Human Rights Enlightenment Enlightenment project, which was basically a series of after-school special type videos contracted by the government meant to educate children on social issues like discrimination. I just can't find these anywhere. I've looked really hard. They only seem to have ever been distributed physically on VHS tape in the early 90s. And as far as I can tell, nobody's uploaded them online. If anyone can find these, please, I want to watch them so bad. I'm so curious what the fuck these look like and what they are. But it is very funny. Another notable project here, this one is interesting, is the 1996 movie New Kimagure Orange Road, Summer's Beginning, which is one of the movies from the Kimagure Orange Road franchise, which was a very popular romantic comedy series in the 80s and 90s in Japan. Several sources indicate that very similar to the production of Zillion, KyoAni actually did the majority of the work on this movie, and it was possibly ghost directed by Ishihara. KyoAni is directed in a production or credited in a production cooperation role, and Kigami is officially the animation director. But I saw a lot of people saying that, like, basically Ishihara, like, this is like the first movie that he directed. Even though he's not actually credited as the director, he's credited as like Inshutsu, which is the title you'd normally give an episode director on a TV show, and you don't use it for movies very commonly. So I thought that was an interesting one that popped up. So as you can see, in the 90s, it was a lot of them just like working on absolutely everything under the sun. They were hiring up all of their, like, most of the really famous people that would be critical of their later successes. And you've got these really weird, obscure little projects that they start working on. But this leads us into the Kyoto Animation in the 2000s, which this is where they are finally now, we're catching up. They're fully transitioning into independent production. So by the beginning of the 21st century, KyoAni had amassed tremendous experience under that Kurosuke model, and then with people like Ishihara Tatsuya and Takemoto Yasuhiro building up their resumes as directors, all that was happening, but often invisibly and only on other studios' projects. KyoAni at this point was really actively seeking ways that they wanted to develop their own projects. They were now like really getting into how do we like break into being able to make our own things. To this end, they did a lot of stuff. One thing that they established, I think this is fascinating, is they have the Kyoto Animation Professional Training School. This is a like small vocational school that KyoAni runs and manages on site that trains new potential employees. This is like a big scale official version of basically what Hata Yoko did with the housewives back in the 80s. The teachers of the programs, and there are two, there's an animation course and an art course, are all major figures at KyoAni. And Kigami himself was one of the first teachers who worked at that studio, like when it was established at the school. And so that like expanded his already informal role as a teacher and mentor into an official teacher, teaching all these new potential trainees how to do work in the KyoAni style, basically. And this school is still running today. So it's still one of the main pipelines KyoAni uses to support its kind of independent nature, is it has a really robust means of bringing in and training new potential employees to be at the level of like quality that they need in order to be able to do these independent productions, because you need a lot of really good people to do that. At the same year, KyoAni may have developed a pilot for a series. So this is a thing that I kind of went back and forth on whether to include this because of the source, but I thought it was worth including. This might all not be totally accurate. The only source of this info is Yamamoto Yutaka, who we will talk about more later in the season. He has a less than stellar reputation, but he was a prominent employee of KyoAni at the time. The short statement to make about Yamamoto Yutaka is he was the director for the first 4 episodes of Lucky Star, and only the first 4 episodes of Lucky Star, at which point he was no longer at KyoAni. So we'll get more into all that and all the drama behind him later. But this is an interesting interview he gave where he said that KyoAni created a pilot for a series based on the Japanese folktale called Kasa Jizo in 2000, and that this pilot was storyboarded and directed by Kigami, and that the pilot was actually made, he claimed, that the series was ultimately dropped, and they decided not to go forward with it because they thought it was too plain and, quote, literary for it to be financially successful. That might not be true. I could not find anybody else talking about this pilot. Obviously, it hasn't been like leaked or out there in any way, but if it did exist, Yamamoto would know about it. So I thought I'd put it in there as one of the other things that they may have been doing at the time to try to find a way to make an independent production. Another one here, and this is one I went a big thing with because I ended up watching this whole show. In 2001, Kyoto Animation worked on a Tatsunoko Productions show called The Soul Taker. They made episodes 3 and 6 in that gross uke model of Soul Taker. This is notable for a bunch of reasons, one of them being Soul Taker was Tatsunoko Productions' first fully digital anime, and was also either one of, or maybe depending on how you define your terms, the first high-definition anime broadcast. It was broadcast in what they called high vision at the time. This would have been 720p. It was only broadcast in that resolution on like a very select station, but it was marketed with that as the main angle at the time. Unfortunately, there is no Blu-ray of Soul Taker, so the only way you can watch it is in 480p, but it isn't like widescreen and all that stuff.
If it was 720p, it actually, you're getting into tough in between areas there. Yes. Where like you kind of can't natively present it on disc because you would either be upscaling it or downscaling it. But yeah, that's curious. Now I want to check this out.
Yeah, it's an interesting show. We'll see a little bit here why. Needless to say, Soul Taker was a pretty cutting edge series back in its day. Meaning that any studio working on the series would have to accommodate for what it was going for. And Soul Taker is the second series I have found that has the Kyoto Animation Digital Video Development Studio quoted as working on it. There isn't a lot of information specifically on what this like division or group was within KyoAni, but sources that I found indicated that KyoAni began shifting its production to start working in digital stuff in 1999, and their work on Soul Taker shows KyoAni's early skill and adaptability into digital production. This is something I found interesting after we watched Lupin the Third Episode 0, and we talked a lot there about that really awkward shift to digital anime in the early 2000s, but there are exceptions. Soul Taker is one of the exceptions, and a lot of the stuff that KyoAni worked on at the time, they were clearly very quickly became very good at the digital animation stuff. As a side note here with Soul Taker might potentially come up on a future season of Japanimation Station one day, because the director of Soul Taker is Shinbo Akiyuki. He is best known as the kind of iconic, really well-known director at Studio Shaft. He's director of Madoka Magica, of the Bakemonogatari series. He's the director of Nisekoi. Basically, if you think about Shaft's style and the kind of slightly odd style they have and like the head tilt and the weird cuts and stuff, that is Shinbo. That style is all over Soul Taker, maybe even too much. It's like maybe a bit too unfiltered, but it's pretty interesting. Studio Shaft made episode 10 of Soul Taker in the Gross Muke model. And that connection of them working on episode 10 is how Shinbo met the then president of Shaft Animation. And later in 2004, he joined Shaft kind of off of that relationship. And from 2004 on, he was like the main director at Shaft. So in this weird way, somehow I ended up learning all this shit about, like, I was not expecting to learn any of that stuff, but it's, it might come up again. Soul Taker's weird. It's kind of a good show. Not amazing, but pretty interesting. If you like Eva, you'll probably like Soul Taker because it's kind of in that style. Anyways, back to KyoAni. This work on Soul Taker then led to a really significant opportunity for KyoAni. In 2002, they produced or co-produced a comedic spin-off of the Soul Taker, the 6 episodes, this weird series, Nurse Witch Komigi-chan Magical Cart, which basically is a spin-off starring the really interesting character from Soul Taker that's kind of the standout character, Komigi. And they co-produced this with Tatsunoko Production. This is KyoAni's earliest prominent and official animation production credit, not co-production, because they made the first 2 episodes in their entirety of a 5-episode thing, but episodes 3, 4, and 5 were made over 1 year later by Tatsunoko Productions. So in effect, really KyoAni made a 2-episode OVA series that then Tatsunoko later expanded on a year later. The 2 episodes made entirely by KyoAni were directed by Takemoto Yasuhiro. He was also the guy who directed those episodes that they made for the Soul Taker show. And if people want to check it out, you can watch Komigi-chan without watching Soul Taker. That's not directly related in the plot. It's just taking the characters, putting them in a totally different setting. And episode 2 of Komigi-chan is quite good, and it really shows the kind of meta otaku humor and animation you would associate with some early KyoAni stuff like Full Metal Panic Fumofu, Haruhi, Lucky Star, which Takemoto was really heavily involved in all of those. And so you can see there's a lot of DNA between that and some of those shows that he directs later. And getting into that later, in March 2003, KyoAni finally released its first fully original production, which was an OVA titled Munto. Munto was directed and written by Kigami Yoshiji, who did not want to direct the project, but the Hot has encouraged him to do so because he was the most experienced person at the studio. Munto is a really interesting curiosity. I watched the 2 OVAs they made for it. It's an early isekai story that uses the isekai trappings as just a metaphor for like growing up and coming of age. It's very much like A Spirited Away in terms of narrative structure, if not nearly as successful as that. And if it was a full feature-length project, if it had like 30 more minutes on it to really flesh out everything it was doing, I think it would be a legitimate hidden gem. As it is, it's kind of like awkward and rough around the edges, if like an interesting thing to check out. One thing I found fascinating is it has mostly amateur voice actors. Like most of the people that are voice actors in the first Munto OVA, that's like their only credit. This feels like a byproduct of it being KyoAni's first project, that like they presumably just didn't have as much connection in that world. They went like small for it with Munto, because once they remake Munto as a TV show in 2008, they recast everybody, and it's all traditional classic voice actors. A lot of the voice actors that worked on other early KyoAni productions, they basically cast in the Munto TV show. So that's like an interesting little area there. We're not covering Munto. It's weird. If one day we do another KyoAni thing, I'd like to look at it, because it's only interesting if you know KyoAni and you've seen a lot of their stuff. It's fascinating to see the like seeds in there of like a different direction they could have gone and what works and what doesn't. The other major KyoAni production in 2003 was KyoAni's first solo-produced show, Full Metal Panic Fumofu. Fumofu is a comedic spin-off of the mecha school romance series Full Metal Panic, and this was also directed by Takemoto Yasuhiro. While Fumofu was KyoAni's first full TV production, they did not yet have the full staff and experience to produce an entire core independently. So Tatsunoko Productions, amongst a bunch of other companies, assisted heavily in the production. Tatsunoko specifically created 4 of the 12 episodes in their entirety. So like 1/3 of the show was actually animated by Tatsunoko. So which is a thing I didn't know, but it makes sense if you look at Fumofu, which I rewatched ahead of doing some of the stuff. And you can definitely tell it is not as consistent as later KyoAni stuff, and it makes sense why. And that then leads us finally to January 2005, which is when KyoAni produced Air, an adaptation of the popular visual novel by Key. Air was produced entirely by KyoAni without using the Grosuke model at all, and it quickly garnered attention in the industry and from fans for its extremely high level of quality, turning KyoAni into an identifiable brand name amongst otaku. From this, KyoAni made a name for itself and would go on to adapt Key's other visual novels, Kanon and Clannad, each successive year, with Clannad After Story airing in 2008, and that is what we are going to start covering with our first section for the show. So in reality, while Fumofu is the first like kind of TV show they make, Air is the first thing they make that is actually, this is the model that KyoAni uses to make their shows and would continue to make their shows to this day.
Awesome. This is a long history lesson, but I find it fucking fascinating. This was like deeply engrossing for me, at least, Sean, and clearly for you, because you wrote all this up. But no, that's fascinating, and I think it's cool to see all that backstory. I mean, it makes sense. Where I think if you were to just tell us, Sean, like, Air is their first, full TV series, that doesn't communicate, okay, it's their first thing after decades of work and experience and building up, and the people working on this are, like, deeply, deeply experienced, and it's a culmination of a lot of things, and that's very cool.
That like touches everything. Like it, like it's the roots are in everything. Like I couldn't believe that I learned about the founding of like 2 or 3 of the most important studios in anime history by looking at this. Like, oh, they were like directly involved with the founding of Production IG. Oh, and then later, like they, not the founding of Shaft, but of what you understand Shaft as being. It's like they weren't directly involved in it, but there's like this weird. You could do like a 6 degrees of Kyoto Animation for anime thing, except for you couldn't, because it would be like 2 degrees. Because anything further than that is like, they're so closely knit with everything in the history of anime. There's one little last section here that I couldn't figure out where to like kind of intersperse these throughout the history thing, but they're all things I want to just kind of touch on, because I do think it's important to kind of like understand about KyoAni as a studio, is like everything about their studio culture. So Kyoto Animation is super well known in the industry for its positive and equitable environment as a studio. This is evident as early as 1992. In 1992, Kyoto Animation was the subject of a local newspaper interview that described the studio culture as, quote, kind, comfortable, and filled with warmth. Like it had like it's a very short little snippet that I found from another person who put together an article on this stuff. But it definitely like describes it as very like warm and homely environment, which is interesting because it's the same kind of language that is used by KyoAni Studios talking about the studio today, and that article was talking about in 1992. Kyoto Animation is notable for employing more women at more stages of production than other studios. Kyoto Animation specifically won the 4th annual Women in Animation Diversity Award in 2020. That group is like an international group put together to promote women in animation and stuff like that. So it's a fairly new group. They won that award from them. Kyoto Animation's production model means that they rarely use freelancers, and instead they hire people as full-time employees with benefits. It's notable that most of the experienced animators discussed in the early sections of my notes here rarely stayed in one place for more than 5 years. Like, think about all those people, like Kigami, like Sugiyama Taku, Kusube Daikichiro, all of them were leaving studios and going to try to start their own. Some of them, like Kigami, started his own studio, then left the studio that he started and ended up in KyoAni. Comparatively to that, Kigami stayed at KyoAni from 1991 until his death in 2019, and Ishihara started working at KyoAni in 1987, and Ishihara is still there. One article I read, I love this detail, identified that a woman who started working in the 80s when it was still called Kyoto Anime Studio is still working there, and that her daughter had recently joined and had been working there for about a year. So the sense of KyoAni being a family company, both it's run by a married couple, but also throughout it, like, families work there. Like, so many of the different people I read about, like Kigami, his wife worked there. Ishihara's wife works there, right? And now it's like children who start working there with their parents. Like, it's pretty crazy. According
it's
to
just rare. Like, you were talking about, like, you know, the longevity of people working there. You know, you hear about someone who maybe, like, goes and founds their own studio and they'll be there forever. Miyazaki's never going to work for anyone other than Studio Ghibli. But under them, there's plenty of turnover and there's lots of people leaving, and, you know, and so it is just super rare to have all the people not just above the line, but below the line. You know, the people not just at the top, but lower in sort of the credits there, too. It's really cool to hear about.
Yes. According to a source I found, KyoAni's starting salary for a new animator was third highest in the industry, but because the cost of living is substantially lower in Kyoto than places like Tokyo, it means that the salary comparatively is actually way higher by quite a substantial margin. So they also pay very well within the industry. And then one last additional note, this is nothing I couldn't find anywhere to go, but I want to mention it because I don't want to just say KyoAni makes everything entirely independently, because it's not true. While KyoAni rarely outsources, there are a few things that they do use or have historically. There's Animation Do, which, whether they call this outsourcing is a little bit, I don't know, but you'll see it's credited a lot on KyoAni. Animation Do is a subsidiary that KyoAni formed in 2000. That's basically was their studio that worked out of Osaka. Animation Do was officially totally reincorporated and is just called part of KyoAni again in that full corporate structure. Even though that studio still exists, they just don't call it Animation Do anymore. And that happened in 2020. So they kind of like reconsolidated that into the main company, because Animation Do did do some outsourcing for other studios as well. I think that might be one of the reasons why it was separated out into its own thing. The other main place that you will see be credited in terms of them outsourcing occasionally is KyoAni partners with a South Korean studio that is currently called Studio Blue. On the older stuff, they were called Anna Village. And they are outsourced predominantly for background art. So, like, that is the other thing that you will see on almost everything. You will see Anna Village or Studio Blue credited. But other than that, that's like about it. Like, it is again, even more so than Ufotable. They make their own shit, and they keep it very in-house.
Yeah, that's all really cool, and it's nice to hear about. And, you know, just a good, I think, counterexample to how a lot of this stuff works, not just in Japan, but around the world, obviously.
Yeah. So,
because obviously it can be successful. They're an extremely successful company. They're about as successful as you can get. And it's just, this whole story, it's like, I don't know, it's very fulfilling to hear about.
Yeah, I'm glad that, because that's how I felt, like, reading it. It's like, the more I digged into, like, more I was like, oh, this is fucking fascinating. Like, it's not the thing I feel like when you look up the history of lots of companies, it's just like, oh, this guy, you know, he got a lot of experience here. He had some connections to the industry. He had enough money. He started up a company, hired some people, and it's like, it just worked. Here, it's like, it touches all these different places. You've got, I think the business strategy of KyoAni is so fascinating, and then seeing that slowly work out over the course of, like, such a long period of time as they start building more experience, they establish and expand their studio, until eventually they make their own thing, because it's just this, like, long, slow game they play, and it feels like KyoAni is just it feels like the most intelligently run business I have ever seen. Like, every move they've made historically just feels so smart and so successful, and shows, like, the patience, and how that kind of patience really pays off, and the way in which being an equitable studio, caring about, like, the well-being of your employees, that is, like, not a thing that holds you back in, like, the cutthroat world of business or whatever bullshit capitalists tell you. It's like the whole strategy for KyoAni, and the thing that the rare interviews that Hata Hideaki gives, you'll always talk about, he grew up in like a rural family that like his family were farmers for generations. Eventually he left and became that accountant, but he was always taught about like how to raise and nurture the land and vegetables. And he's like, our philosophy at KyoAni is we want to raise and nurture people. Like that's what we do. It's not about, you know, throwing people under the bus to make sure we hit the deadline or whatever. It's about growing these people up, picking them up, and like creating this family with all of them. And it just, obviously the results speak for themselves in terms of the people that work there and how happy they clearly are, based on their employee retention and when you read interviews from them, as well as the success of the output of all the stuff they make. It turns out happy people make a good art. And that you don't have to be cutthroat. You don't have to be an asshole, genius person or whatever. You can be nice, happy, good people having a happy, fun time. And that's how you make really good art, it turns out. And KyoAni is like the best example of that.
Absolutely.
All right, so to wrap up this episode, Jonathan, I've got a couple of questions. One is the big question that I'm just curious to know what you have to say, but there's a couple things here. One, I'm just curious if you have any background here. Do you know anything about the visual novel studio Key, which they're the company that made Clannad and Clannad, any of the stuff with like their games, why their games are very important and influential in the visual novel world?
No. I know them from you bringing them up somewhere on the UFO Table season when we talked about visual novels. That's it. Okay,
so we'll have a whole conversation then. I'll teach you what a Nakige is next episode on Japanimation Station. All our fun genre terms. Jonathan, I want you to describe for me, what is a slice of life anime?
Well, that's like it's weird. It's because I want to say it's just what it sounds like, right? I mean, on some level, it is a TV series that is low stakes about people. Or they don't have to be people. Polar Bear Cafe is a slice of life anime. They just happen to all be animals. And it is about just, you know, fun. They're usually comedies, but not necessarily like madcap comedies, right? They don't have to necessarily have crazy hijinks. It can just be very low-key character-based humor, or it can be more madcap. Generally episodic, maybe with a light sprinkling of serialization. Is that basically sort of how you would describe it?
Yeah, I think that's pretty on point. Yes, because we've never really covered slice of life before, and KyoAni is like they made basically what the modern slice of life anime is in a couple of ways. So you've got some experience here, and then this is the big question. We've been doing anime podcasts for a long time, and I feel like I've brought this term up in passing, but it's never been a context where it's like I wanted to stop and actually explain it, because I have another note conversation that just says the Moe talk, and I have a bunch of notes I throw together in there because we have to have the Moe talk and we just haven't had it. But I have legitimately no idea, Jonathan, if you have any fucking clue what it even is. Tell me, what is your understanding of the term Moe?
Well, did you bring it up back when we talked about Gundam Double Zeta and Puru, or is she a different kind of character?
Yes, I would say you can, Moe is a complex philosophical concept, you could call it. But Pudu would be something that I probably would have mentioned it there. I maybe find her Moe.
I see, that's the thing. I think I remember you doing the entire Moe talk back then. That was a while ago now. Gundam Double Zeta, I think we reviewed that 2019. So that's like 4 or 5 years ago now. But no, I mean, it has something to do with like characters who are cute young girls, right?
Sure. It has something to do with that. That's the right way to describe it.
Yeah, there's more to it than that, but that's what I know. I mean, Moe has like, I read something about this in an article I was reading for my dissertation recently of like you can kind of trace Moe history back pretty far. People talk about like different sort of precursor characters before it sort of had a terminology around it. Probably Pudu is honestly one of those. I don't think anyone sat down and was like, let's make a Moe character in Gundam Double Zeta. I don't think the term was used yet.
The term did not exist at that point.
Yeah. But go ahead. Are you going to give me the Moe talk now, or are we going to...
No, not now. No. I just wanted to know where to start.
Okay.
Like how deep do you go? Because that is one of the things I'm excited about with this season of the show is we are going to be tackling genres and things we have just never covered, whether it's on Japanimation Station, Weekly Zoo Gundam, or on Weekly Stuff. Slice of life we've never really looked at. I would say we've never really done what I would describe as like a comedy show, things that have comic elements, but it's like, Nichijou is just a comedy. Like, I don't know how else you would explain it. There's no other genre you need to attach there. It's just a comedy. And then this is the era of Moe. Like, there's a reason why I called Suzumiya Haruhi that section when Christmas comes to Otaku Town, because this is like the era of the otaku. This is in KyoAni, like, is so vital in establishing what that is. And the moe is infused, particularly throughout everything we're watching all the way through. I mean, everything, but particularly K-On! It is just like a driving force in the otaku world. It is so important for making KyoAni the success it is. So I wanted to see if you had, because if you asked me this question, what is moe, and I had to explain it, I think I would have to spend like 10 minutes talking about it. But like you just saying like, it's like little girls that are cute or something, that tells me where to start.
Yeah. But like not in a gross way. Like that's the thing. Like if I say moe, like I don't know, for people who don't know, like it's not in a creepy way. Like it's they're fun. It's fun.
Yes.
Right?
Yes.
Bochi the Rock, that's kind of moe, right?
Yes. Yes.
Are they too old?
Bochi the Rock has moe stuff in it. Yeah, for sure.
Okay. Cool. Yeah. I'm not super up on the terminology, but there you go.
Okay, so we won't have the moe talk right away. You know, moe is definitely involved with the key stuff, but when we get to Haruhi, especially K-On!, I mean, there's a reason why I titled the K-On! Section Moe Money, Moe Problems, which there's no way I'm the first person to make that joke, but I did really like that joke.
I love that joke.
So KyoAni, man, I'm so wildly excited to finally be able to cover these shows. I'm very glad that we made the choice to do this episode, because this is about a 2-hour long recording.
Yep.
That there is no, like, imagine, Jonathan, we did all of this, and now let's talk about a 13-episode TV show. Would have not been possible. So this is going to be the biggest and most badass episode of KyoAni ever. It's like Gears of War 2. It's bigger, it's better, it's more badass. That's what Japanimation Station is bringing you this year with the Kyoto Vacation.